Whenever nations consider the avoidance of war to be the highest priority and refrain from combat, the international system falls at the mercy of its most ruthless member. Throughout the Cold War, Finland and Sweden held a policy of neutrality to keep away from the crosshairs of Soviet-American rivalry. These days, Stockholm and Helsinki are closely tied to Western institutions, but neither has joined NATO. All the same, Sabre-rattling on Ukraine's border has reignited the debate as to whether the time for non-alignment is past. The strategic calculus has changed, and both the Finns and Swedes are weighing their options. President Putin wants guarantees that NATO will stop its expansion, and he's using an estimated 100,000 troops deployed near Ukraine as a negotiating stick. But the dare may have tipped the scales. Russia's recent actions prove its unpredictability, so Sweden and Finland must now consider whether it's safer inside NATO or outside. I'm your host Shirvan, and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's video is sponsored by Masterworks. You've probably heard talk of inflation in recent months. Central banks are printing money with no regard for future consequences, and prices have surged as a result. Now, the usual way to hedge against inflation has been to invest in stocks, gold, or real estate. But there's one asset class that few talk about: contemporary art. By some measures, contemporary art has outpaced the S&P 500 by 174% from 1995 to 2020. However, most people can't go out and buy multi-million-dollar pieces to diversify and protect their portfolios. Masterworks changes all that by allowing retail investors to own a slice of artwork. It is the only platform that gives access to great works of art, including Banksy, Monet, Picasso, and other iconic artists. All you need to do is create an account at masterworks.io and then browse and invest in their artwork offerings. From there, you can either hold on to your shares until Masterworks sells the painting and you get your earnings, or you can sell your shares on the Masterworks secondary market. Use the link in the description to skip the waiting list and register. And as always, in everything related to investing, tread carefully. Nothing is risk-free. Finland, Sweden, and Russia share a long history of back-and-forth conflicts. Sweden, in particular, confronted Russia over regional supremacy, while Finland acted as the battleground in the middle. You see, in the aftermath of the Finnish War of 1809, Sweden surrendered ownership of its eastern territories to Russia, from which the Grand Duchy of Finland was formed. But Russia's victory was not to last. A century later, in 1917, during the turmoil that followed the Russian Revolution, Finland secured its independence. However, as the Russian Empire transformed into the Soviet Union and attained its footing, relations with Finland broke apart. Moscow made some unreasonable demands, Helsinki refused, and then hostilities erupted in what became known as the Winter War. Yet, against all odds, Finnish forces repelled the Soviet invasion and reached a stalemate, admittedly one with many loose ends. Then, in 1941, the Finnish leadership overplayed its hand and joined Nazi Germany in an attack on the Soviet Union. That attack failed, and Finland ended up ceding nearly a tenth of its territories to the Soviet Union. Moreover, Helsinki and Moscow came to an agreement and signed the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. The contents of that treaty embodied what is now known as Finlandization. At its core, Moscow accepted Helsinki's independence for as long as the latter abstained from military integration with the West. And true to its word, Finland maintained its neutrality throughout the Cold War up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Once the USSR broke down, policymaking in Helsinki became more flexible, and the country joined the European Union in 1995, but stopped short of joining NATO. Sweden's story is less dramatic, but the stakes are just as high. Though Sweden no longer has a land border with Russia, the Russian exclave Kaliningrad, one of the most heavily weaponized regions in Europe, sits at about 300 kilometers from the Swedish island of Gotland. which is vital in projecting military influence in the region. Gotland ensures the sea and air defense of the major Swedish urban centers, including the capital, Stockholm. Following its devastating defeat in 1809, Sweden has voluntarily pursued a policy of non-alignment, which is what kept the country out of both world wars and the Cold War. It was a policy that proved surprisingly successful. Even at the height of Soviet power, Moscow honored the understanding. Neutrality has since become a hallmark of Swedish foreign policy. Yet, much like its neighbor, Sweden relaxed its posture and joined the European Union when the Soviet Union broke apart. Even more, Sweden supported the 3 newly independent Baltic states to join NATO, but ironically never joined the alliance itself. Sweden and Finland share strategic interests, which is why both countries kept their neutrality during the Cold War and why both countries joined the European Union at the same time. But there is more to this story. Although Finland and Sweden claim to be non-aligned, in practice, the two have a growing partnership with NATO, taking part in joint exercises, scientific research, environmental issues, disaster management, and so on. Finland and Sweden also enjoy deep bilateral ties with NATO members Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States. These NATO-oriented relations have been growing steadily since the 1990s. Nowadays, the reality is that Finland and Sweden are tightly integrated into Western institutions. Their neutral policies steadily dissolved as the Soviet Union came crashing down. The only thing that is neutral in Swedish and Finnish policy is their official military non-alignment, which places them outside of Article 5 of NATO that triggers collective defense should one member suffer an attack. For the Russians, that seems to be good enough. But NATO's command structure would like nothing more than to have Sweden and Finland join its ranks as full members. Both nations would bring considerable leverage to the alliance. Finland and Sweden are some of the few European countries that never significantly cut military spending after the collapse of the Soviet Union. While much of continental NATO let its guard down, Helsinki and Stockholm maintained well-trained and well-equipped militaries with top-notch technologies. Sweden, in fact, produces and exports some of the finest military weaponry available worldwide. All this makes Finland and Sweden more compatible with NATO doctrine than most existing NATO member states. Equally important, should Sweden and Finland join NATO, it would turn the Baltic Sea into a NATO-dominated space. This would have profound consequences for Russia, since much of its trade and energy goes through the sea. Losing the Baltic Sea to NATO would shake up the balance of power. It would leave Russian interests exposed to foreign pressure. It would also dramatically strengthen NATO's logistical capabilities towards Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Over time, a NATO-dominated Baltic Sea would grow into a fundamental security danger to the Russian Federation, restraining its maneuvers and options. The inclusion of Finland and Sweden into NATO would also allow the alliance to push even closer to the Russian frontier, leaving Russian forces spread even thinner on the European plain. Now, we discussed the European plain in a previous report, so make sure to check that one out, since it explains the Russian need to push westward. Either way, Finland and Sweden joining NATO would steadily result in a NATO-dominated Baltic Sea and more substantial NATO presence in the Baltic countries. Russia would have no choice but to inflate its military spending to unsustainable levels. Clearly, this is not a scenario Russia is looking forward to. However, the way Russia treats its neighbors leave much to be desired. Against the backdrop of the Ukrainian crisis, Russia has mobilized about 100,000 troops on Ukraine's eastern frontier. Meanwhile, Russian policymakers have published a list of demands to de-escalate tensions, including a ban on any future NATO expansion. The abrupt crisis has fired up debate in Helsinki and Stockholm about NATO membership. both nations are now rethinking whether it's safer outside or inside NATO. Russia's foreign ministry joined the debate by stating that Finland and Sweden joining NATO would have serious military and political consequences that would require an adequate response from the Russian side. Considering what's at stake for the Russians, they're not bluffing. But whether this threat means an embargo, open hostilities, or a proxy conflict is up for speculation. Either way, the Russians will not sit idly by and watch their security dwindle. Right now, the lack of political consensus is the primary reason discouraging Finland and Sweden from joining the ranks of NATO. Public opinion is a dynamic force determined by distance, time, and culture. If Russia provoked a crisis with Japan, it would bear little influence on Europe. But when Russia generates a conflict with Ukraine, the culture, time, and distance are compatible enough to shape public opinion in neighboring states. That means the longer the crisis in Ukraine persists, the more public attitudes in Finland and Sweden will shift towards NATO membership. While public support for NATO membership in Finland has remained low and steady, in Sweden it has been on the rise. According to research by the Society Opinion Media Institute, there is roughly equal support for joining NATO as those opposed, with polls hovering at around 30%. However, in 1994, when the Institute began researching public opinion on NATO membership, 48% believed that joining was a bad idea versus 15% in favor. So clearly, support for joining NATO has been consistently on the rise. How the issue develops will depend on the political debate ahead of next year's general election. If the pro-NATO political parties perform well at the polls and knock out the ruling minority center-left of power, they could push for a referendum on NATO membership. Even if the 2022 vote turns out to be more of the same, Sweden could still become a member of NATO before the decade is out. Public opinion towards NATO membership has been consistently on the rise, and in democracies like in Finland and Sweden, governments cannot ignore parliamentary majority viewpoints on a foreign policy. Sooner or later, the Finnish and Swedish governments will get behind parliamentary security policies. While territorial invasion is not an immediate threat for Sweden or Finland, Russia's recent actions in and around Ukraine prove that Moscow is unpredictable. The more Russia pushes westward, the more it pokes at its neighbors, the more public attitudes in Finland and Sweden will shift in favor of NATO membership. Having said that, while Finland and Sweden may sing a different tune these days, the secret to geopolitics remains the same. Make a good treaty with Russia. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you found this video useful, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching and Sahol.